Hey, Christina here. Welcome to my crystal art series. Today I will be sharing with you the process behind my filtered barrier artwork. Let's go. So this is my mood board, and you can see that I explored a lot of different options when studying the Tourmaline stone. The first couple of things that came into mind was a lot of ancient things, a lot of structural things, a lot of things from the city. So maybe the one thing I found in terms of nature was tree bark and glaciers. So the tree bark, because of its texture, I thought that really connected with that type of nature. And glaciers, because of the edges of the glaciers, when they're breaking, they have those layers, kind of like Tourmaline. So that really kind of spoke to that being a glacier reference. And then tying it back to the old times with the Greek ruins and temples, the columns really kind of rang a bell when I was looking at pictures of Tourmaline. They have a lot of different textures, but what really gave it away was the vertical lines that Tourmaline stone has, and it really resembled the columns from the Greek temples. So that was what came to mind when I was looking at the stone and what I wanted to approach in my design. And then I thought about the Empire State Building because of its structure. It had the similar height as well as the blocky kind of structure that it had to it, and that really mimicked what Tourmaline is. So I kept with that thought process, and then I started thinking about other skyscrapers in the city and the overall cityscape and the shapes that it creates. A very different vibe compared to some of the other stones that I was looking at. Another thing that I was really looking at was Ireland, the castles in Ireland to be particular, because they also carried that type of structure, the blocky kind of rock texture. And that was something that I really wanted to stick with. So those were my inspirational sources that got me started on this piece. And the overall meaning behind this piece is to focus on keeping everything blocky and rigid to showcase the characteristics of Tourmaline, but also the rigid shapes speaking to a cityscape. So that was another thing that I was thinking about when designing this. And overall, the piece conveys the idea of building your own wall or barrier from the negativity of the world, society, or the city, just to avoid any negative impact on your own life. That is the reason for why the fading city in the background is a thing, because what I'm trying to say is that we know that the city or society is part of our daily life, but we must learn to build a protective shield around us that prevents anyone's negative vibrations or energy to spill into our barrier. We need to learn how to filter our energies and cleanse ourselves every once in a while of any type of negative vibe, because this is what's going to help us with our mental health. So that was basically the story that I had connected to this piece. And I thought it was rather strong. And I think it proves a really big point that sometimes we need to escape the everyday life in order to just protect ourselves or just to revive ourselves sometimes, because the consumption of everyday city life or the news of every day can get very tiring, and it can definitely weigh us down on our energy source. So just be careful. So now I'm going to share with you what I did in Procreate. So starting with the very beginning, where I started sketching out some thumbnails this time, focusing on the flow and the composition, and selecting one and proceeding. And I loosely started to add my shapes in with the lasso tool, but keeping everything grayscale in the color palette because I wanted to stay very close to the likeness of Tourmaline. I wanted to explore the different heights of each shape and cutting away at the edges of each shape with the eraser tool so that it feels rigid. And that was trying to figure out how I wanted the cityscape to look. And I came in on the tallest shape and added in some random lines just with the round brush tool to make it look like a building, but also to replicate that repetition that Tourmaline has within its line structure. I started to add in more smaller shapes in the front of that building to help guide your eye and use some warmer muted colors to show the focal point. Next, I used a corrugated brush texture to create a more softer line texture to showcase the further away you are from the city, the quieter the noise becomes. And next I wanted to play with the perspective tool to create some dimension within these shapes to help lead the eye to the focal point. And it added in a stucco brush texture over the dark brown shape just to give it a little bit more of an earthy vibe, not so industrial like the corrugated brush, because as you get closer to that wall that I have in the front of the piece, is basically how close to nature you are getting because you are trying to escape all that noise in order to protect yourself and filter anything that doesn't serve you. Next, I really want to accentuate the edges of the shapes because I know the things were getting a little lost in the piece, so I thought to highlight some areas with a particular brush, which was the pine line brush, and it kept everything organic, but it still gave you hints of what the shapes were. And I also used the gloaming brush to highlight some of the other areas and break up some of the shapes so that you could see the different layers, as well as adjust the transparency on these shapes as a whole so nothing looked too flat. This is me exploring, so in this piece I was really trying to show the level of depth and the level of importance. So lastly, to close off the piece, I really wanted to accentuate those big walls that I had in front of everything else. So I just wanted to add in a fresco brush to just showcase that little aura within the wall, because that wall is your aura of how you are going to approach the world. And that little gap in the middle is how much you will let the energy from the outside spill in, and that's basically filtering. So you choose what you want to digest. So I took this to Illustrator, and from there I laid out my canvas 8.5 by 11. I made 2 rectangles 4 by 6, and I bumped them together and I made a center line. Turned that into my guide. I merged the 2 rectangles together to create a whole shape, and then with each corner of the rectangle I marked 2 ticks at each of the corners because that was going to be my line for cutting things down to size. Other than that, I placed my artwork on the right side of the card because that was the front, and all my details I put on the back, and we were pretty much ready to go. So from there I took my piece to my drafting table to score it. So I laid out my piece on my scoring board and I ran my utensil down the card to make that indentation so that it would fold clean and seamlessly. And that was all thanks to my bone tool, and that is a good tool to use in terms of folding. Now the next thing was to cut it down to size, And I brought out my cutting board and my X-Acto knife and ruler, lined everything up to those small little ticks that I had in my corners of each of my rectangles, and basically I cut it down to size. And that was pretty much it for cutting. And in terms of finishing it off, I lastly just added some silver metallic paint, and I pretty much focused the metallic paint on that tall building structure because I wanted to show that level of importance, that focal point within the piece. And that is it, guys. So thank you so much for listening and for coming along on this journey. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, guys.